Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, a co-founder with Deborah Woroff of this program on MECFS, The Alert. And I'm talking today with a very important man in the research and the development of a public position on this ghastly disease that has affected so many people, more than 1 million in this country and maybe as many as 17 million around the world. My guest is Dr. Leonard Jason. It was Leonard Jason who, looking at the numbers, doing the research, said, wait a minute, there are a lot more people than our government, the US government, through the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, or the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, said there were. They were saying there was about 20,000. Leonard Jason, a doctor of psychiatry at DePaul University in Chicago, did the research and persuaded the CDC that there were at least 800,000 victims of chronic fatigue syndrome. Incidentally, it was the CDC which gave the name chronic fatigue syndrome, which has been so unfortunate and is so misleading, rather than the old name of myalgic encephalomyelitis. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you.
How did you get into this?
Began studying this from a personal experience of getting mono in 1989 and not recovering. It took me about a year and a half before I was able to come back to DePaul University, first on a limited basis. And when I did come back and finally got enough strength to start thinking about doing research in this area, I decided that prevalence and epidemiology was the most important thing to look at the early 1990s. And the reason for that was because if you have an illness that's considered rare, particularly an illness that's called a yuppie disease, which it was, then it's not going to be taken seriously. So even though I wasn't an epidemiologist, I realized that as a community psychologist, I could put a research team together to try to really find out what the accurate numbers were.
Now, tell me something about DePaul quickly.
DePaul University has about 25,000 students. It's the largest Catholic university in the United States.
And it specializes in?
It really has a mission for service. We teach, we try to do public service, just like St. Vincent de Paul did in France several hundred years ago.
Coming back to the problem of how many patients, if it is calculated there are too many, and CDC has now said as many as 4 million, that makes it very difficult to establish biological markers, right?
We've suggested that there's probably 800,000 to 1 million people with this illness. The CDC, over a 10-year period of time, changed their estimates from about 20,000 to over 4.5 million. We believe the only way that that type increase could have occurred, because we've been studying people during that 10-year period, and we haven't seen those types of increases in our natural history studies that we do. We've concluded that it's possible that the case definition has been broadened. And the reason we're concerned about that is if you look at depression, people who have major depressive disorder, that's one of the most common psychiatric symptoms and diagnoses. If you have about 2.5% of the population that has major depressive disorder and about 2.5% of the population that is now thought of as having CFS, you begin to wonder, is it possible that some people with this chronic fatigue syndrome label possibly have been brought in people with major depressive disorder to get the numbers up to 4.5 million.
And this is quite serious.
It's serious because if you misidentify people and you bring folks in who have another illness, then you possibly will have much more difficulties finding biological markers for this illness.
You've become a famous figure for your work, and you get a lot of telephone calls. Tell us about those and how heart-rending they can be.
There are literally hundreds and potentially thousands of people who are locked out of the healthcare system. If you have cancer, if you have heart disease, if you have AIDS, there are treatment centers you can go to have diagnostics and a treatment plan put together. If you have this illness, you are, in a sense, locked out of the healthcare system, unfortunately, because you can't go into a physician and have 3 or 4 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes and have an appropriate diagnosis and treatment plan with something as complicated as this.
Why do you think this has been a disease so shunned, if you will, by the medical profession?
It's complicated, it's difficult, basically it's not a simple illness, and to basically do appropriate treatments takes a lot of time, and our healthcare system has difficulties dealing with complicated health issues like chronic fatigue syndrome.
Around the globe, who is doing the best job with chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, I'm particularly impressed with the Japanese. The Japanese have a model where they basically have taken some federal support, spread it around to some of the best and most famous scientists in Japan, and really stimulated research from a first and a second generation of people. And I think that type model has worked extremely well, has generated some fascinating research, and could be replicated in this country.
Here in the United States, what is needed now? What could we do now if we had the will?
If we had the will, we'd have a series of settings, tertiary settings, kind of places where you could go in and you could get a good workup, diagnostic workup, and you could have a treatment plan put together, and you could have training of physicians and healthcare workers and even researchers being part of that. And then those people, once they got their diagnosis, could have a connection with people from their local community. So what we need is a network of settings where people can get appropriate diagnosis, treatment planning, and training for other healthcare workers. We do not have that now.
There will be more of my conversation with Dr. Leonard Jason on a future episode of MECFS Alert. This is Llewellyn King in Washington.